Good morning, folks. We're going to get started with our program here in Biddeford just momentarily. If you've had a chance to pick up a program for the day, they're over on the table as you're coming into the room. But on that program, we noted that every remote location is going to have their own kind of location-specific introduction. And here in Biddeford, we're lucky to have the Mayor Alan Casamant join us. I'd like to have the Mayor come on up and say a few words of welcome. Thank you.
Good morning. It's certainly a pleasure to be here, and I want to welcome all of you, whether you're here or out there. Strange times indeed. If you've been to Biddeford before, I'm sure you've noticed a lot of changes, probably including me. I think since the last time you were here, I've gained like 10 pounds, and you might say it's the COVID calories, but really, it's part of my job description. I have to eat in every new restaurant that opens up, and that's killing me, actually. But it's worth it. But seriously, there's been so many things happening here for a number of reasons. An individual tagged me on Facebook a few days back, someone I met once, but there was a community up in northern Maine that was saying that they were asking for individuals to offer suggestions on how to improve in this economy, what things to do to become better, and he tagged me and said to them, go to Biddeford. And the reason why is because so many things have happened here in recent years, probably some of them in spite of me, if not all of them in spite of me. But I look back, and there's a couple of key things I just want to share with you. One is that when I first became mayor, a department head pulled me aside. We have a great staff here. I think that's really indicative of what's happened. Pulled me inside and said, if you can guarantee or create political stability in Biddeford, you're going to find investment will come here. And for those of you that don't know Biddeford has always been very volatile in terms of politics. Former Mayor Sacco said to me when I first got elected 9 years ago, he said, and he was kind of bragging, he said, you know, Alan, let's compare things. In Sacco, we play touch football politics. In Biddeford, it's tackle, and you kick each other when you're down. We don't do that anymore. Not at all. In fact, the councils have been really, really good in terms of not taking anything personal when they're talking about any particular issues. It stabilized things, and I think that helped the investment. The other thing that's really interesting is that we did everything that most communities do, and I think it's important, you know, look at what's your assets. I mean, obviously the mills are our asset, our architecture is our asset, the University of New England is an asset, the coastline, whatever. But what we did something that was off the grid, off the radar. It created pride in community that was lost during the end of the Milltown era. So just a quick example, we put flower boxes in the downtown, a lot of them. And some people say, oh my God, what a waste of money, blah, blah, blah. But you know what it did? People started bragging about Biddeford. 10 years ago, 8 years ago, if you looked on Facebook where somebody lived, they would put in the Portland area. Now they put Biddeford because of community pride. And the evidence is everywhere. I mean, even in COVID, we're doing so many. The garage is under construction. The Lincoln Street Mill, $50 million project is under construction. You can see what this wonderful mill with Doug Sanford has done. Things are really, really doing well. And I think the centerpiece is because of pride in community. And I'd like to suggest that in COVID, if there's any blessing at all, is that people are now focused more locally. And I think that's going to be the secret to the economy in the upcoming years, where people support each other, whether it's in the stores or the restaurants, or even in terms of needs. Because let's face it, even in Biddeford, we've got our issues like every community does, but at least through volunteerism, we're working together. So again, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually thrilled that you're all here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Those are great comments. And I would also like to welcome everybody to the GrowSmart Annual Summit. This is an unconventional summit. I think we're breaking some new ground in the format of the event. And I am very excited about what we're going to talk about today and the event itself. Before we get too far into the program, I would like to acknowledge the unceded indigenous lands that we occupy at all of today's sites. I'd like to begin by recognizing that we're on the traditional lands of Maliseet, Micmac, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, and Abenaki people. This is important. It's appropriate to recognize that, as one of the 14 states, I think, that recognize Indigenous Peoples Day that was just last week. But I would also like to note that one of the unique things about this conference is that we've got people connecting in person and remotely from multiple locations around the state. Also in person, also remote from their own desks, wherever they may be. These are challenging times. They're very unique times, but I think that there's opportunities that come with that as well. And one of the opportunities that is very evident with this program is that there are people attending who otherwise would not have been able to attend if this event was only in person here in Biddeford. So thank you to everybody again who's joining us, but I'd also like to thank our regional partners who are making some of those remote locations available to people. The Northern Maine Development Corporation and University of Maine and Presque Isle, the Eastern Maine Development Corporation and Bangor, Sunrise County Economic Council and Washington County, the Kennebec Valley Council of Governments, and the Snow Pond Center for the Arts, which is located in Sydney, and Stevens Commons and Hollowell. And I would ask that you join me in thanking those regional sponsors for helping to make some of those sites possible for attendees. And of course, this is also an appropriate time to recognize all of our sponsors for today's event. Without sponsorship, events like this would not be possible. I'd like to offer a special thanks to Central Maine Power, the Nature Conservancy, Bangor Savings Bank, Kennebec Savings Bank, Maine Housing, A New Development, and Wright Ryan. And these companies and organizations are located all over the state, are working to make Maine a better place, and I'd also like to thank them at this point for their sponsorship as well. So with just a few words about the program before I introduce Nancy to the podium, today's event is a shorter format event than past GrowSmart summits, but the format is also going to be extended virtually next week as well. So after today's program, we will be meeting again online as a follow-up to today's event. And we'll talk about some of those ideas that we talked a little bit more about today. First up, we have a couple keynotes this morning that I'm really looking forward to. We're going to be talking about issues that have long been at various points in the foreground and always in the background of conversations when talking about organizing and how we work in Maine. There will be some time for the keynotes to speak together as well, in kind of a trademark GrowSmart tradition. And then we'll be having local breakout groups here in Biddeford, as well as people joining us virtually and breakouts at individual sessions to talk about some of these ideas around regional solutions and the power of home rule. And finally, we will be having GrowSmart Awards. Always look forward to those. That will be happening over lunch this year, which I also always look forward to. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Nancy Smith to come on up and talk a little bit more about the work that GrowSmart's been doing over the past year and what we're looking forward to coming up. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's so good to be with you here and here and here and here and here. It's an extraordinary day with our hybrid summit, and as part of that, we have our annual meeting, and one of the requirements in our bylaws is that I update you on our work. You all have seen In whatever location you're at or virtually, you were emailed our annual report for fiscal year 20, which is from July 1st of 2019 through June 30th of this year. I wanted to spend just a few minutes delving into some of the details and talking about things that wouldn't fit in that format. Primarily about the different kinds of outreach that we've done over the last year and some of the outcomes that have come from that. First off, in recognition of COVID and the issues that we dealt with, that we're all dealing with, GrowSmart Maine chose to offer free membership in our organization to municipalities across the state. So far, we've had 25 municipalities take advantage of that. Part of that membership is free admission to the summit, so we have some participating for the first time, which I find exciting. We knew that this was not the time to be asking municipalities to pay for a membership, but we wanted to stay connected and offer the resources that we have, and offering free membership just seemed to make sense, and I'm really pleased that so many took advantage of it. Another piece of outreach that I worked on for, I think, the past year was trying to find a niche for GrowSmart Maine to support rural communities that had opportunity zones. We know, and there's concern across the country, that smaller towns may not be able to take advantage of the investments that this program was designed to make possible. And in those conversations, I have yet to find a niche for GrowSmart Maine, but I met Philip Hussey as he was dealing with this issue while earning his MBA at Georgetown University. Philip is now one of our nominees for becoming a new board member for GrowSmart Maine. One of our longer-term collaborations has been with the Local Wood Works program. This is an idea probably 5 years old now that's housed at Kennebec Land Trust. The idea is to take the ethic we all know so well for buying local food and translating it to Maine's wood products community. GrowSmart has been a part of this from the beginning, one of about a half dozen partners. Over the last year, I got to know Kirsten Brewer when she was working at Kennebec Land Trust, and she is our second nominee as a new board member today. I think 2 years now, I've been in conversation with John Wigan and others at the Snow Pond Center for the Arts in Sydney. There's this wonderful idea of a multi-town economic development plan based on arts and culture as economic drivers, smart growth, and quality of place. While we have yet to find the funding needed to launch this, the partnership is there, and it's one of the reasons that Snow Pond Center for the Arts is one of our venues today, because of the relationships established. One of our most significant collaborations is as part of the Maine Broadband Coalition. We've been a part of this from the start. I work both in the advisory council on the structure of a coalition, as well as a leading role in policy and advocacy. You'll read in our update, of course, one of the biggest wins is a 75% affirmative vote by the people of Maine for a $15 million broadband bond this summer. The pandemic has made it even more clear that we need broadband for everyone. And again, with GrowSmart, I look, what is that niche, what is our unique voice, and it's how do we address this need for essential infrastructure without accommodating sprawl? And how do we work with communities so that their rules in place will make room for broadband as we all need it, but with continuing to have growth where it's with development that already exists for all of the benefits. The Economic Development Council of Maine, GrowSmart Maine has been a member now for a couple of years, and it gives me the opportunity to connect with economic development professionals at the municipal level and the regional level, as well as to connect with our regional planning commissions. And again, those relationships and getting to know folks is part of the reason that they have taken the leap of faith with us today and sponsored our satellite locations across the state. I'm excited by all of that. The Maine Alliance of Smart Growth is a program of GrowSmart Maine. It is one of our key focuses now and into the future. The vision of the program is that each of us works in our silos, and often silos get dissed. Now, I'm 20 years on a farm. Silos have an important role. We do our work in the silos. This is good. Every once in a while, we need to get out of our silos. So in the Maine Alliance of Smart Growth, whether people are focused on their municipality, historic preservation, downtown revitalization, land conservation, farmland, we do good work in our offices, but to come together and acknowledge the interrelationship and interdependence of those things is essential. Honestly, it's the strength of GrowSmart Maine. We're the one place in the state where we talk about historic preservation and farmland conservation could never be seen as competing efforts. They work together to keep Maine being extraordinary. One of our outcomes this year for the Maine Alliance of Smart Growth is the Smartinis event. Smartinis are 90% networking and fun, 10% mission. They were supposed to launch in April. Clearly that didn't happen. But in August and then in October, we had these small events. They're intended to be no more than 20 people as a chance to see smart growth on the ground. So we have walking tours or scavenger hunts. Downtown Augusta, where our office is, there were, I think, 15 examples we easily had of smart growth. Stevens Commons in Hollowell was the host in October, and they were able to demonstrate both open space with hiking trails owned by Kennebec Land Trust, as well as the reuse of this campus that was I believe it started as a school for wayward girls, and has evolved into mixed-use, extraordinary location. So the Maine Alliance of Smart Growth will continue to be a priority for us into the future, even as we're being COVID compliant and having them outdoors and limiting the number of people. Internally, GrowSmart Maine approved a 5-year strategic plan in January of 2019, and I can't even say it without laughing that having a 5-year strategic plan during a pandemic is amusing. But it still gives the guideposts that we need to make sure that we're on track. We can't let go of the work that we want to do while we are all, one of the phrases I've heard is that we all pivot until we're pirouetting, because it's a constant pivoting to try to remain relevant, remain in business, and do good work. With all of that, our goals for 2021 are to build on the work that we've been doing. We know that we're having an impact. We do advocacy, events, and community engagement. In the coming year, we will even more particularly focus on racial equity and climate change. These are not silos. These are not things that we do on certain days with certain programs. For all of us, these need to be woven into all of the work that we do if we're going to have any relevance in the outcomes that we create. My board and staff have had the extraordinarily interesting, exciting, uncomfortable conversations about both of those issues that are essential if we're going to engage and make a difference here in Maine. I'm looking forward to 2 particular programs as we go into 2021. We partnered with the Island Institute over the past year to take their energy efficiency toolkit and launch it statewide. This is a community campaign that will lead to boots on the ground assistance for communities to have. Initially it was weatherization, which doesn't happen during a pandemic, so more broadly into energy efficiency. We're also taking that model of an informational workshop and coupling it with that boots on the ground technical assistance for housing choices for a well-rounded community. If you were at our summit here last year, Jeff Levine was one of the presenters at a breakout session on this theme, and what we found is there's an incredible demand from communities. As they're looking at community revitalization and economic development, some forget that housing is an important part of that, and there are tools and strategies for communities. So we're looking forward in the coming year, as we adapt to COVID, to being able to bring that to communities across the state. So I hope that you'll read the annual report. It's one of the handouts you have or one of the PDFs that was emailed to you if you're virtual. That's a little bit more in depth on what we're doing and is, I think, an important part of the annual meeting component of this day. And with that, we're going to dive into the program of the day. Jeff Levine is going to introduce our first keynote speaker, and I thank you all again for being here wherever you are today. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Ben. It's so exciting to actually be at an in-person event. And I think it's a testament to the common sense approach that people in Maine take about so many things that we're all able to follow rules and do events like this. Everyone's wearing a mask. We're all being responsible. And that's really, one of the things that's great about this state and why I'm so optimistic about the future of Maine. Briefly, the topic today is really on how home rule, which is traditionally seen as a very insular thing, can integrate with smart growth and with regional planning. And that starts off seeming like a very exclusionary sort of set of things. New England has this strong tradition of home rule, which basically means that cities and towns can do whatever they want as long as it's not outlawed by the state. And when I moved to Minnesota, when I was younger, I was shocked to find out that's not true everywhere in the country. And it really was quite a sobering assessment. It seemed so much easier to do regional activities when you didn't have that ability for communities to be sort of ornery and come up with their own ideas. But on the flip side, I think there's a real opportunity there, and I think that's what we want to explore now. Maine is actually one of the strongest home rule states in the country. There's different levels of it, and Maine's pretty much brought it up to 11 to some extent. There's a lot of things that even other states with home rule don't allow cities and towns to do. But again, with that common sense approach and the idea that things like regionalism make sense and can actually save cities and towns money, that's what makes me optimistic. And it also makes us bring this topic to the summit this year, because we want to explore that with you and with our speakers and sort of figure out how we can turn that into an opportunity. I want to introduce Colin Woodard first and bring him up as the first keynote speaker. A little aside on how I learned who he was. I moved up to Maine about 10 years ago from the Boston area, and one of the first things I did was read The Lobster Coast. And if any of you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. It really helped me understand so much about this state and give me so much respect for the people here. So I'd highly recommend that. In addition, Colin has done a lot of reporting, a lot of places, but you probably know him most through his work with the Press-Herald regularly. He's also written American Nations, which is a really fascinating look at how the United States really is essentially 11 rival regional cultures. Another piece of what I'm looking forward to hearing him talk about is that sort of tension between home rule and regionalism. Number of other accomplishments. We're very lucky to have him, and I want to invite Colin to come on up and let him talk. Thanks very much.
Well, hello, and thank you to GrowSmart for having me, for all of you for attending today. I'm delighted to be speaking here because this summit is probing something that I'm extremely interested in, which is that essential relationship and tension between New England's civic traditions of local government and home rule, that system where every town, even if it only has a few hundred people, sees itself as a republic unto itself, and a frontier community of 10 sees itself and assumes itself to be such a republic in waiting, and the tensions that has with the clear efficiencies and advantages one would have via regionalization and centralization of some authorities. Now, as the proceedings continue, I expect that we'll all be delving into how to balance the strengths of each of these things and why we wish to do so, and some of the practical details of execution of such plans and the potential benefits. But before that, here at the outset, I wanted to offer an assessment of the legacy we've inherited, to describe why and when and how we here in New England and in Maine developed the structures we now have, and how they shaped who we are as communities, as a culture, as citizens. And therefore, I'm going to say a few words about, thereafter, I'm going to say a few words about a related and tangential set of developments, historical events that profoundly shaped Maine's character in ways distinct from our sibling states in New England, and because of the various strengths and pathologies that it imparted onto our culture and worldview, which are the backdrop to almost any economic venture or public policy discussion or intervention we contemplate, and revealingly, frequently fail to ever act upon in this state. Now, it's a thesis, if you will, about our state, my native state, as we contemplate and imagine a brave new post-coronavirus world. Now, this audience is by now no doubt familiar with the myriad problems of our traditions of home rule and municipal autonomy in a world where the individual's economic and social life takes place at a regional scale, and development decisions and infrastructure planning and technocratic solutions and markets require something approaching a county-scale strategy. we confront a balkanized landscape of often tiny jurisdictions jealously guarding their sovereignty, distrustful of their historic rivals in the town next door, and perhaps inefficient in the duplication of their administrative functions, institutions, and infrastructure that would be provided at the county level in many other parts of the country. Many of us live in one town, work in another, send some of our kids to a grade school in a third town, high school in a fourth, and do our major shopping in a fifth. We want community control, yet our formal definition of community remains rooted to 17th and 18th century spatial scales, when one could spend most of their lives within the bounds of a 6-mile square. The status quo, we've realized for some time, is holding us back. But often lost in the discussion about where we should be going are the strengths of this strong home rule system that has been bequeathed to us, the things we don't want to lose as we remake ourselves for the 21st century. Because this home rule system has roots going back to the very beginnings of the Yankee colonization experience and has profoundly shaped our regional culture in ways so fundamental and so taken for granted that we often fail to appreciate and recognize them. Now, the reason we have such a home rule system here, and to a lesser extent, the swaths of the country first colonized by New Englanders and their descendants in the late 17th to early 19th centuries, is because of the nature, goals, and worldview of the region's founding settlers. Now, those of you who have read American Nations knows that I argue that there was never one America, but several, that the rival colonial projects that took shape on the eastern and southwestern rims of what's now the United States, the Puritan colonies here in New England, the Dutch settled area around what's now New York City, the Scots-Irish-dominated backcountry, the neo-feudal manor-based aristocratic systems of the Chesapeake country, and so on, each had their own distinct ethnographic, religious, and cultural characteristics, were settled at different times and had conflicting ideas about what the good life entailed, about their own original intents, in other words, all the aspects of what anthropologists consider to be culture, that they were competitors and often even enemies during the colonial period, taking opposing stances in major conflicts like the English Civil War of the 1640s and the American Revolution, and that they settled mutually exclusive swaths and tiers of the country through the 1830s, imparting their institutions and cultural philosophies in ways that have endured and can be detected today in everything from dialect maps to election results to the effectiveness of the response to the ongoing pandemic. In most of these regions, central authorities gave land grants to a single person or corporate body, and dissemination of land and power followed downwards, top to bottom, usually resulting in powerful counties, weak to non-existent municipalities, and little control or public participation in politics. But by quirks of early 17th century history, this is not what happened here. The dominant colonizing force in our region wasn't a feudal lord or a chartered trading corporation. It was a group of people, stalwart Calvinists, who believed themselves to be like the Old Testament Hebrews in a covenanted relationship with God, that they had been tasked to come to the New World and to create a more perfect, in their minds, utopian society, a Zion, errand in the wilderness, to put a light on a hill, and that in this project that they had been tasked with by their maker, they would be punished or rewarded collectively as to how they did. They saw a danger, being Calvinists and believing that humans are inherently depraved. You had to keep an eye on them, right? The danger was from within. An individual would rise up or betray the community and endanger it. And therefore, there was a great emphasis on protecting and building the community. What we would consider now building a free community, but for them trying to build their own utopian community. Everything was organized to prevent the outcome of the tyrannical individual rising up and lording over them and returning back to the situation they had fled from in the old world. Here, the towns came first, before any effective colony-scale government. The Pilgrims showed up here accidentally, remember, blown off their course from the Netherlands to New Netherland, and ended up as accidental squatters on the shores of Cape Cod, land claimed by Sir Ferdinando Gorges, the proprietor of Maine. In doing so, they ended up having to create their own improvised social contract, the Mayflower Compact, essentially an improvised town-scale republic, while they have waited getting retroactive permission to settle where they were located. The Puritans, coming with the Winthrop fleet in the 1630s, had many of these same characteristics. They founded Massachusetts Bay, and over the quarter century or so that followed, they annexed the old colony of the Pilgrims, they annexed Sir Ferdinand Gorge's struggling settlements here in Maine, they begat Connecticut, they sucked New Hampshire into their orbit, and created a sort of Yankee empire, spreading their New England way across the region. Now, they were not organized around an individual liberty or proprietary control, but on building this utopian society. So the institutions in the towns were all organized almost as little independent republics from the beginning, with a town common, a meeting house that acted as both church and town hall, taxpayer-financed public schools. The community would gather together to act as the legislature to administer this little tiny republic, initially adult males only, but they often met on a weekly basis. I mean, that was the level to which they were involved in the day-to-day affairs of figuring out what should go on, developing the community, laying out roads, divvying out land, catching the stray dogs and everything else. They elected officers to execute their plans, from selectmen to road builders to tax collectors. County governments were often an afterthought, coming quite a bit later, and usually confined to judicial functions. Today, counties have been abolished altogether in Connecticut and Rhode Island and most of Massachusetts, and of course have very limited roles here in Maine. Each of the towns sent their own representative from their town to the assembly. In other words, the towns were the republics operating under a collective body created later to deal with higher functions. Now, these evolved to cover all sorts of things that would be handled by cities most anywhere else in the country, or counties. The school system, libraries, building permits, planning, trash disposal, even in the early days, militias for defense. Philosophically, as the 18th century began, New England started embracing the fact that they had this legacy, realizing it was a vehicle for civic education and democratic engagement with fellow citizens, for therefore economic and social prosperity as they saw it. These town-scale institutions, especially town meeting, fostered political engagement, which created new political communities, which in turn trained citizens in the habits and skills of Republican self-government. Government was seen not as a distant and probably tyrannical power here, but as an extension of ourselves. These are our schools. This is our town library. These are our town policies. We know because we showed up and governed them. It's our schools and our school board. That's not the way the system worked in much of the rest of the country. Now, these factors were recognized all the way into the early republic. John Adams, entertaining a visitor from Virginia in the 1780s, the visitor was concerned. He was one of the aides-de-camp to Lafayette, and then he had spent a lot of time walking. He would walk 50 or 60 miles a day to examine the countryside when he went back to France and was in the retinue of the King of France, and when he went to his home in Virginia, and when he visited New England, he was walking all over the countryside. And he came to Adams because he was so impressed and bowled over, in his view, of New England and how he felt it was superior in its civics and layout to his own home in Virginia. And he asked Adams, what would you do to make Virginia more like New England? Now, a lot of his counterparts would not have agreed with this, but this was what this particular visitor wanted to know. And Adams told him, if I were to write you a prescription for it, you'd create the meeting house, the schoolhouse, and the training field for the militia, that these are the causes of growth and defense of New England, that all the virtues and talents of the people are there formed, their temperance, patience, fortitude, prudence, and justice, as well as their sagacity, knowledge, judgment, taste, skill, ingenuity, dexterity, and industry, said Adams, the big proponent of New Englandness. Alexis de Tocqueville, coming a full 2 centuries after the Puritans had landed, was coming here. He was a French nobleman, and his task was to understand and take lessons back to France that could be used to hopefully foster a successful Republican democratic experiment there. Because France had had a revolution after ours, and it had, of course, failed, collapsed unto itself, led to the Napoleonic Empire and a terrible defeat and a highly centralized government. And he was coming here to try to learn lessons, and in the process, in writing his book, wrote what is, people always go back to as this sort of well of understanding our country through the eyes of a perceptive foreigner in 1831. And what his book said in the end, most of all, the ultimate lesson was that the future success, the success to that point of the American democratic experiment, had to do with within ourselves, whether or not individuals could be Republican citizens, whether you could foster and perpetuate an environment, the social and community infrastructure, the legacy that would allow individuals to be prepared and want to and successfully engage in governing themselves. That was the entire trick to the experiment. And in his book, he of course idolized the New England town meeting as he encountered it. What he didn't fully appreciate, although he was being told by all of his sources in New England this, was that this, of course, form of government did not exist outside the greater New England space. And in fact, none of those lessons, which are brought forward in de Tocqueville's book, would apply in a good half of the country. And so his prescriptions were often missing many of the other regional cultures. But what he was being told, if you go back to his letters, from the people he spoke to, they were speaking very specifically of how New England functioned and how its strengths had drawn out of that experiment, had grown out of those habits of the heart that were created essentially by the local government traditions and the home rule system. You know, his Jared Sparks, he was the editor of the North American Review, which is sort of like the Atlantic, all things considered, and PBS NewsHour all rolled together in that time period. He was sort of our country's first political scientist, and he basically told de Tocqueville, if you go back to his letters and stuff, he wrote, at de Tocqueville's request, an entire treatise on how town government had shaped New England that draws in and informed de Tocqueville's works, and essentially told him that the town meeting and its associated local government were the wellspring upon which New England functioned and which the whole democratic experiment rested on in this part of the world. And he was impressed by this because, imagine, compared to in France at the time, the things that he would see these tiny New England communities doing, road building, assessing taxes, running schools, were things that not only did towns in France not have the permission to do, only the authorities could execute those things. The central authorities operating out of Paris, the Interior Ministry, would have to be involved if you were to lay out a new road. And so that greatly impressed him as you look back. Emerson, in 1835, talked about this as well when he was celebrating the 2nd century of his hometown of Concord's birth, an address where he talked about how that ownership, that sense that government is us, and that we participate in it actively, that we as individuals have been involved in it, that made people truly feel that they are lords of the soil. In every winding road, he said, in every stone fence, in the smokes of the poorhouse chimney, in the clock of the church, they read their own power and consider at leisure the wisdom and error of their judgments. That sense of government and tightness. And consider that, contrast it with the situation in, say, the Deep South and the Chesapeake country. In these areas, the model was a county courthouse, often located without a town around it, that protected in the original Tidewater, a English-style manorial estate. That was the model, right? In the Chesapeake country, they were coming there to reproduce the feudal system of the manorial countryside, to be sort of Lord Granthams, like a Downton Abbey of the time period, with indentured servants hopefully playing the role of the serfs. That didn't work, so it devolved into slavery. And in the Deep South, an entire slave system of major plantations was grafted directly from the West Indies by the early English Barbadian settlers into the low country of the South. But in both cases, the role of county government, of the county courthouse, in the absence of towns, was not to build community in that way, but to protect the rights and exclude others from one's property, family, or society at large. Counties were governed by justices of the peace, who were also the heads of the county courts. And these justices were not elected, they were picked by the governor or the legislature from slates of names submitted by the sitting justices themselves. The governors in many of these states were, of course, appointed by the legislators, not by the people, and to vote for a legislator, you had to meet strict property requirements and the like. Some were seen in this political tradition, this classical Republican tradition, drawing on ancient Greece and Rome to be fit to govern, and others to be governed, and that was the way society should be organized. This was realized even into Reconstruction, in that period when essentially the Yankee coalition had defeated and occupied the South and was trying to remake it in its image. That would be the cure to avoiding a future civil war, was to somehow occupy and remake the South as a Yankee place. and they saw the town government as the linchpin that came in and tried to actually organize New England-style town governments across many southern states. But these were violently resisted as being illegitimate because they were coming from a conquering power, and oppressive because of the power and politics and divisiveness of trying to undo the race-based slave and now caste systems in the South. And so it was thrown out in the 1870s, and the reaction in those regions of the country, something that persisted for nearly a century thereafter, was to make sure this never happened again by cutting and reducing the power, scope, and spending of the town and county governments even further to neuter them so they could never again pose a threat to the proprietary interest. So that's changed in the South and the Tidewater, of course, but that's the legacy going back within living memory from which it's drawing to compare against the legacy of these strong home rule and town meeting government forms. So today, that's a lot of the reason why you see in New England at large the highest levels of civic engagement in the country, of voter participation, of communitarian resolve. Indeed, that's why it contributes a great deal to the fact that we have the lowest COVID-19 prevalence rates in the country, save for Vermont and trailing slightly behind in New Hampshire. So these are things that we don't want to lose as we move forward and figure out how to do regionalization and operate at higher levels, that sense of ownership and resolve and civic engagement. Now, I also wanted to say a few things contextually about a related issue, and that affects a great deal about what happens in the state and our efforts to move forward, and sometimes there are things that hold us back. And that is that Maine did not start as part of this whole New England way and, Yankee ethos, right? Maine was founded by Sir Ferdinando Gorges, and it was supposed to follow essentially the same model as the Chesapeake country in Virginia, right? He was given control over, the entirety of all the land from, Virginia to Newfoundland in theory, and he was going to divide it out into, large, land settlements that would be given to dukes and called duchies, and they would divide them into counties for counts and baronies for barons and hundreds and farthings, and you'd have all the people working on the land and recreate that system, just as the Virginians wanted to do. And that probably would have led to very bad outcomes for Maine. But when the English Civil War came along in the 1640s, Sir Ferdinando's, understandably sided with the king and the Anglican established church and the powers and prerogative of royalty and the feudalism against the Parliament, who was standing for the other churches and for breaking down of these privileges. And Massachusetts Bay, of course, backed Parliament. And so in the aftermath of the English Civil War, when the king lost his head and Parliament was triumphant, suddenly Sir Ferdinando Gorges was without allies back at home. And Massachusetts, in the 1650s, moved creatively to annex, in some cases with a force of arms and behind troops, the Maine settlements, which had been settled separately and had been independent. And the important part of this story for us thereafter is that from the 1650s through statehood, 200 years ago this year in 1820, Maine was something unusual in the North American experience. We were a colony of another colony. Not only that, an overseas colony, right? Massachusetts referred to us as the District of Maine because New Hampshire was in between. They didn't even border on us. And it ended up, all these things we just described, all of these advantages of the New England way and home rule and these things that are embedded in our culture and have given us these advantages I've described, and also some of the disadvantages, these things came from and after the Massachusetts takeover. But the colonial experience was, on balance, a very traumatic one in Maine despite this, because Massachusetts ruled Maine as a colony in the interests of the metropole of mainland Massachusetts, so to speak, not necessarily the settlers here. And they were very traumatic experiences because of the Puritans' worldview. It precipitated a century-long series of genocidal wars against the Native American inhabitants of New England. And during those wars, which lasted from King Philip's War in the 1670s all the way through what we call the French and Indian War in the 1760s, the brunt of the damage and trauma to the European side of the fights happened in Maine, because Maine was a frontier place where, despite the epidemics that had been introduced after contact within New England's indigenous communities, despite that, in the 1670s and 1710s and 1720s, Native Americans still outnumbered the English settlers here. And in Maine, unlike in Massachusetts, the settlements were following not the nucleated settlement, the patterns of little villages that the Puritans put together with their little republics unto themselves, but rather manorial estates, independent, self-sufficient farms set up and down creeks and rivers, just like in the English West Country, which were completely indefensible in time of war. So over and over again in these conflicts, one after another, a half dozen of them in this century-long period, most of Maine's settlements were wiped out. And the English settlers, escaped, to Damerscove and Monhegan, and then tried to get away to Boston, which was choked with refugees, and the tensions between the refugees from the Eastern Territories and from the metropole led to all kinds of problems, including the Salem witch trials, many of whose victims were in fact refugees from the Maine territories. But what ended up happening through the course of all of that is that Maine was stunted in its development, that it was not able at a time when the strategy was to move forward, right? Everyone was farming, and you had 7 kids. You couldn't all get a seventh of your farm because everyone would starve. So the strategy was they would then go out to the expanding frontier and settle new towns, and then the grandkids would be on the next set of frontiers. But during these Indian wars, essentially, it was impossible to extend into the frontiers because the frontier was dangerous, and therefore there was this enormous land hunger that had developed during this century. And that brought the second problem with the colonial period, the second traumatic experience, which was that the various proprietors and land interests in Massachusetts formed to try to capitalize on the likelihood that the wars would end and the property would become enormously valuable. And so they had on paper these huge land estates. The local settlers, though, who had been coming to these places without the permission of the landholders and settling the backcountry, often people of Scots-Irish descent with strong ideas about individual liberty and natural rights, fought back. And so as soon as the Indian Wars ended, Maine then experienced another nearly century of an armed insurrection in the backcountry between the squatters and earlier settlers and the ambitions of some of the great land proprietors like Henry Knox and the Bowdens and the Gardners and so on. I tell this story because that whole experience caused such animosity that it propelled Maine towards eventually passing a referendum on statehood, combined with Massachusetts' behavior in the War of 1812. That means that in many respects, from independence in 1820 and then the powerful pull that Massachusetts has continued to have on Maine's economy and society and development and demographics and everything else, that Maine has remained a post-colonial society in many respects in its outlook, right? Like other post-colonial societies, there's this sense of pride and defiance and oppositional stance and skepticism towards any ideas that come from the old empire, right? Massachusetts things are somewhat suspect in some way, in ways that are not constructive when that's our natural partner and we're part of the greater, sort of Boston MSA engine here. But that causes all of this friction and tension. But also a sense of, insecurity, self-doubt, risk aversion, right? That things won't pan out here somehow. That you can't think too big because all of it will come to naught. And that sense of not having the confidence to bet in ourselves. And that's something that I think has plagued our state and its sort of culture for a very long time. And when I speak to other people, it comes out in the business communities and others trying to do things and develop things, that sense of being unsure of those things. And it's unfortunate because Maine's no longer the economic backwater that it ended up being after the collapse of its traditional industries in the late 19th century. Our location now has enormous advantages. The internet and other technologies make it possible for us to play and realize our potential in many, many respects. And we draw on all these powerful strengths and traditions and resources. So, we need to get over all of those things now. But recognizing that they're still with us has to be part of almost any conversation we have about our future. And with that, thank you very much. I'm going to stop.
Thanks. It's always fascinating to hear the story of Maine. I remember my initial impression of it was they built a bunch of towns, then they all burned down, Then they built a bunch of towns again. They all burned down. It's obviously much more complicated than that. And every time I listen to him explain the story, I get a new nuance of it. So really appreciate that. I want to now introduce our second keynote speaker, Anthony Flint. He's going to be joining us remotely. What I want to say about Anthony is I met Anthony probably more than 20 years ago when I was working as a city planner. And he was working for the Boston Globe. He was covering a major redevelopment project that I was working on. So it was sort of our initial relationship of reporter and sort of buck planner in a city, government. And since then we've run into each other in a number of different ways. I think we're really lucky to have Anthony speaking with us today. He is currently with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He does a lot of work on various issues related to municipal finance, local government, all the stuff that we're really interested in, regionalism. Previously, as I mentioned, he was at the Boston Globe for a great deal of time, over 20 years. He worked in Massachusetts state government on smart growth issues. He's also been at a Loeb Fellow at Harvard University and a number of other places. You'll see his writing all over the place, The Atlantic and other publications. He's also written a couple of really fascinating books. Want to shout out to a book called Wrestling with Moses about Jane Jacobs that's particularly worth reading, and a more recent book on Le Corbusier. So for those of you who are planning or architecture junkies, highly recommend his books. And with that, I'm not sure how to do a virtual handoff, but I will assume that somebody has that under control who's more tech savvy than me. Welcome, Anthony.
Well, let's start with the picnic and the park, the neighborhood and the city. The National League of Cities identifies 31 Dillon's Rule states, 10 Home Rule states, and 8 states that apply the Dillon's Rule only to certain municipalities, and 1 state that applies Home Rule to everything except taxation. So that's 40 out of 50 states setting the parameters of municipal government's legal and taxing authority. Broadly, as Colin and Jeff pointed out, cities and towns build on a foundation of self-governance and local control, but need permission from time to time from the state capital for many initiatives. The first part of that equation is critical today, I'll argue, because it's at the local level we see the innovation in policymaking. And of course, it's the local governments that collect the property tax, which is such a stable source of revenue, particularly relevant in these perilous times. So at the local level, that's where the rubber meets the road, or I should say where the bicycle tire meets the dedicated bike lane. A few examples of why home rule is so important. Negotiations occur in something like payments in lieu of taxes from nonprofits, strictly at the local level. Now, localities, of course, might look to other cities or nationally for guidance. In the case of Maine, you had the big controversy and backlash because your former governor tried to make it essentially a statewide program. Now that had legal and constitutional issues, but I think it demonstrates the most important point, which is that these are cities and towns that are, continue to really struggle to maintain good municipal fiscal health, and they are best suited to enter into these negotiations. They know these institutions, the eds and meds in their midst. They know best. Local knows best, and the revenue, which is of course very modest, as I'm sure many cities and towns joining us here today can attest, from something like payments in lieu of taxes, it's an important supplement to the budget. Cities are also experimenting. I mentioned innovation with new ways to finance infrastructure, community amenities, affordable housing, And of course, affordability is increasingly important in our red hot and very successful metropolitan areas. One mechanism that I'd like to look at the local level again is land value capture. Now, this is where it's a recognition that government action and public investment, a zoning change, or installing a light rail station in a particular district, all of that is really what drives and prompts huge increases in land value for private landowners and developers. A portion of that increase, the land value increment, is returned and reinvested to the community to promote more equitable city building. That's the essence of land value capture. In Denver, which is shown here, in return for rezoning, developers get to do mixed use density in a former industrial area. In return, the developers are required to provide more affordable housing. This sometimes is referred to, as you well know, as a density bonus. Other examples, Seattle is an interesting place to watch in this regard. A similar program for more than a dozen redevelopment districts. Hawaii and Maryland have sought to fund new light rail lines, in part by harnessing the land value increases around planned stations. And Miami is another interesting case that is looking into land value capture mechanisms to help pay for green, resilient infrastructure. This mechanism has been widely used in Brazil and other parts of Latin America. In the US, the legal framework needs to be considered according to each state's constitution. But it's at the local level, once again, that we're facing these huge challenges where this kind of out-of-the-box thinking should be allowed to play out. A quick footnote, in Maine, you become partial to using tax increment financing, or TIF, which I should point out isn't exactly the same thing as land value capture. Generally, TIF is a process of jumpstarting capital investment and amortizing the property tax payments over time. It has its own set of issues, but it's a similar concept and can be enhanced to achieve spatial equity goals. The bottom line is local jurisdictions with solid planning departments need to be able to avail themselves of these kinds of cutting-edge tools. Well, now I'd like to turn, hopefully not too quickly, to some downsides of local control. I live in Brookline, which has that town meeting form of government that Colin referred to. It's a great tradition. It's sort of the ultimate Norman Rockwell expression of local democracy. But what's happened over the years is it has become a kind of a vehicle for opposing change. It's often driven by a minority of residents dedicated to preserving their neighborhoods just the way they are. And in Massachusetts, a 2/3 majority is required to change anything, to do different things in terms of zoning, allowing more multifamily housing at transit stations, for example, allowing accessory dwelling units, or reducing outdated parking requirements, minimum parking requirements that we all know jack up the cost of housing. Now, Governor Baker's housing choice bill, which is languishing in the state legislature at the moment, will make what most consider would be a reasonable adjustment to just that 2/3 majority piece. Because in vote after vote, just to do something as simple as legalizing accessory dwelling units, a majority are in favor, but not this 2/3 majority. Some frustrated advocates for more housing, by the way, I'm sure you're familiar with it, associated with the Yes in My Backyard movement, have proposed a ballot question to change Brookline, which has about 60,000 residents, from a town to a city form of government. Brookline easily qualifies for this. Nearby Newton is about the same, and they have a city form of government. Now that would allow a mayor and a council to approve these even modest measures like legalizing accessory dwelling units. We think about the sort of the greater good of the community, and affordable housing certainly qualifies. So this is an example of how this sort of long established and proud tradition of local control can work against broader community goals in the current context. And so as we zoom out or go into the higher up in this nesting of scales, let's turn to regional planning. It's an approach that has struggled to have meaningful traction in this country, though it's widely used with good outcomes in Europe and Asia and other places. Let's look at the regional framework first at a very practical level, which you are all, I'm sure, familiar with. The MWRA, which provides water and sewer services across these many communities in the Boston area. Individual cities and towns have banded together for procurement. Neighboring towns might share the cost of a fire truck, and so on. We've seen this kind of banding together to form potent alliances in many other instances. These are 10 local jurisdictions that have joined to promote economic development in Northern Virginia. Another great example is the Colorado Compact, which seeks to prevent the sort of senseless race to the bottom, every town for itself dynamic that occurs with offering tax breaks for business location. And so this is an agreement, a pact, not to sort of compete with each other to offer the biggest and best tax break. And the regional framework, inarguably, is appropriate for planning infrastructure. There's an interesting initiative that I urge you to check out in Northern England. It's called UK 2070 and the Northern Powerhouse Initiative. And basically, the short version is linking these older post-industrial cities like Manchester with better high-speed rail. And if you look at Manchester and you squint, you can see places like Hartford or Worcester or Biddeford or Lewiston. The Rebooting New England initiative is something that was dreamed up at UPenn and a studio led by Robert Yarrow, who is the former president of the Regional Plan Association. And this is an idea to reroute the Acela, to link together the legacy cities, and to establish a true high-speed rail network that would go beyond that to other cities, Worcester, Portland, elsewhere in New England, quite similar to what's been implemented in Northern England. Now, especially today, when more people are working remotely, this instantly expands the housing and labor markets between the successful cities of New York and Boston. So there's plenty of affordable housing in Hartford, and the high-speed rail will get these workers into corporate headquarters when they need to be there. And finally, let's zoom out even more to the scale of the mega region. This is a framework that was developed by America 2050, the Lincoln partnership with the Lincoln Institute and the Regional Plan Association. Many others have been working on this. Jonathan Barnett just published a great survey of multi-state compacts and alliances that have grown up over the years to great effect. The RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, collection of states across a larger scale. The Northeast Corridor is the easiest one to think about, from Washington to Portland, and of course the West Coast and all around Chicago, and in about 10 or 11, depending on who you ask, 10 or 11 of these sort of mega region frameworks. And what is it good for? Well, certainly planning infrastructure, particularly transportation infrastructure, but it's become quite vivid more recently in managing COVID-19. This is a piece that I wrote in April for City Lab, and what became clear was that just how sort of meaningless city and state borders are in terms of managing the virus and confronting the spread of the virus. You saw a lot of activity where, New York and Rhode Island were sort of battling with each other. But the reality was that for any recovery, it absolutely made sense for New York to work with Connecticut and New Jersey in terms of reopening, coordinating reopening of parks. People live in one place and work in another. It's simply impossible to think about this on anything but this regional scale. Well, I'll leave you with this quote from Henry George, which I hope might inspire the ensuing discussions today. I know you are all on the cutting edge of sustainable land use and land policy. Some ideas have their origins many years ago, and some are entirely new, but the common thread is experimentation and innovation. So the implementation of new approaches and new policies has a place along this continuum of nested scales, whether local or regional or beyond. And here's my contact information. The easiest thing to remember is @landpolicy. Check us out, and please sign up for a very low traffic mailing list. I think now we're going to dive into the interactive part of the summit, which is always a highlight. So I will turn it back to the organizers to moderate that discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We're going to go into question and answer with them for a second. If Colin could come, I guess, sit up here, that'd be great. I think you are wired with your own mic, so I think you should be good. Thanks very much. What we're going to do now is, if you have questions and you're in Biddeford, there'll be index cards that you can drop up to me. If you are on one of the other sites, there you can send through the chat to, I think it's GSM Questions. GSM Questions here. Just put your questions in there, and somebody will get them up to me. I'll try to sort of balance all the different questions that we get. While we get organized, a little bit of an anecdote. Anthony mentioned that the town of Brookline, Massachusetts has 60,000 people in it. For context, the city of Hallowell, Maine has 2,500 people. So forms of government don't necessarily relate to size. And actually, I think that's one of those things I'd like to get into. So maybe I'll use moderator's privilege while we're getting started and ask the speakers about that. You know, it's not just home rule versus regional or state governance, but does the type of home rule make a difference?
That may be a question best for Anthony, but I will interject that clearly town meeting government becomes more difficult at scale. The reason we in Maine and other places in New England switch is at a certain point, town meetings become unmanageable. I'm impressed that Brookline is doing this, given that if Brookline were in Maine, it would be the second largest city in the state after Portland. So the fact that you're able to pull that off is, to the extent you do, congratulations.
Anthony, anything thoughts on that?
Well, it is being fiercely opposed. You can be sure. The same neighbors who don't want certain things to change don't want the form of governance to change, and it's really wonderful. But there is this attachment to local democracy. It's messy and it isn't always pretty, but so many residents, particularly long-established residents, want to stick with that form of governance.
Great. So we have our first question, and this is to Colin. Does your historical research point to factors that facilitate actions at the regional level beyond local?
In history and in our past?
Yes.
Well, going back into our deep past, that's a great weakness in Maine, right? We're fractured into, it's like the German Confederation before Bismarck, right? We've got all these thousands of principalities and duchies and grand duchies that, control many of their own aspects and don't trust one another, right? Boothbay and Boothbay Harbor, never the twain shall meet, and the like. So those are always been challenges. What I will say is that, it is striking when you go out elsewhere in the country. I did this series in 2016 for Politico magazine called What Works. It was a series of 5,000-word magazine articles on a successful urban innovation somewhere that's so cool everybody should know about it. So that was the only criteria. So I was going out all over the country and looking for those things. Homeless initiative in Albuquerque, recreating an industrial park in Milwaukee, regeneration of a community in Roanoke, Virginia, in a former tobacco town of Winston-Salem, South Carolina, the creation of the light rail system we just talked about in Denver with its transit-oriented development, and so on. But what struck me as I was doing the series, even though I wasn't selecting for these things, is in almost every single instance, I discovered this commonality, which was that somehow in each of these metro areas, they had been able to convene and cooperate on a broad scale between municipalities, between the suburbs and the city center, and also within society, the philanthropists and the Fortune 500 guys and the city officials and the politicians and Republicans and Democrats and the punk rockers and everybody were somehow able to convene to solve a problem they knew they all had, right? There was something missing in the metro area and they knew that government would be incapable of doing it for various reasons and that the private sector wouldn't be able to do it for other incentive reasons, and the two needed to come together, and they were able to convene. And I realized over and over again there were two things that we never have in Maine. We don't have a convener that naturally everyone turns to who could suddenly say, knights come together, let's solve something, right? We don't have that at any kind of state level, those informal networks. And these leaders weren't an elected official, they were someone in the community who had the power to draw them in. Maybe you would in one community or one sector, but not in the broad scale. And also that we don't see that level of cooperation at any scale between all these municipalities and stuff. So in a negative example, the things that have caused these other places to be able to make big bets on themselves and do these things are exactly where our weaknesses lie. So I think the summit is very correct in focusing on this particular element because our historical record shows quite a bit of weakness in this regard. I mean, you can find various initiatives, but in the end, we're still standing here talking about this even though we've identified it as a problem, now decades ago.
Anthony, do you have anything to add to that?
No, let's turn to let's keep going.
Great. Okay, next question. I'll send this to Anthony first. If we could build from scratch, how do we determine the appropriate scale for decision making and planning?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think that the way Colin has traced it back, there's a little bit of trial and error and a little bit of needing to meet very practical and urgent needs. And so, you really could look at it as, why do we have this system? What is it really good for? But I think in spite of all of that, the spectrum or the transect, if you will, from the block, the neighborhood, the city, the state, the region, take someplace like New England, and then the mega region, say for example the Northeast Corridor, is not a bad nesting of government scales. And I think, though, you can look around at other places, and I mean, it sounds terribly wonky, but they call it territorial cohesion in Europe. And it really does make sense in terms of aggregating and strengthening these economies across a broader scale. And so if I was going to reinvent anything, I would figure out a way to institute more regional planning. And I'm sure Colin has some comments as well, so I might turn this over to him as well.
Great, Colin, do you have anything to add?
Well, mine may be, less informed in that, I don't work actively in this space. I don't have the technocratic skills, so you should definitely look to others for those kind of things. But just contextually as an observer of the history and the background and reporting on these things, my observation would be, I think the answer to the question depends on the problem you're trying to solve. That the scale of, say, planning for railroad transportation initiatives and all that would be different than the scale of if you're trying to plan around how do we deal with big box stores, right, which operate, Walmart wants a 25,000 person catchment area, which is bigger than some of our counties. Yet we're working with, they can play one municipality off another. So, which problem you're dealing with probably answers the scale, and I'm assuming that the answers we work with are going to be bottom-up ones where towns agree to associate with one another for various purposes. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that the effective and appropriate scale for each of those things would be different depending on the problem at hand.
Great. Several questions on a similar theme, and this has to do with how you actually might get to regional planning. Clearly, at times, there's been successes. At one point, there was more annexation going on of communities as transportation got better. In Maine, there's been disincorporation of towns that have realized they don't really need to be anymore. How do you incentivize regional thinking, or mandate? What are some approaches that might work? And I'll have Colin start if you look.
I don't have a strong answer, again, because I don't work into this field, so I'd defer, actually. I'd be interested in what the experts who work on this day-to-day think.
All right, Anthony.
Well, so the question relates to, can you rephrase the question?
Sure, and I think it's a little open-ended, but once we've decided there are things that are best served at a regional level, how do we get there? How do we get these home rule communities to agree to do so? One case many people may be aware of in Maine is the effort to consolidate regional transit in the Portland region. There's 7 regional transit districts in the Portland region, and it's been very difficult to have a good conversation about that. So how do you get people to realize when regionalism makes sense, and what do you have to do to get there?
Well, I think it's an ongoing task, and I think that making the case has a lot to do with demonstrating the economic benefits to everyone. And so take affordable housing. If you look at the rebooting New England proposal, this idea of high-speed rail linking places like Hartford and opening up the Hartford housing market, this would address people who can't afford to live in Brookline or other places around Boston. That frustration, I think, is very, very real and palpable. You can make the case for this more regional framework by suggesting that you can use high-speed rail to get around. If we just expand our thinking in terms of the region, you will be able to find a great place to live that's very affordable. So these sort of kitchen table pocketbook issues would be one way to talk about how a more regional approach makes sense.
I actually have a thought as well. I mean, of course, any effort to impose top to bottom regional solutions on unwilling, home rule, municipalities and jurisdictions is going to raise a great deal of opposition and be difficult. So the ideal clearly is where you can to have the decision, to encourage a context where the facts are looked at on the ground and people realize their self-interest and work together upward. And I was thinking about that because one of the stories I looked at when I was doing that series was on Utah, the Envision Utah effort, which was essentially the largest land use and economic development planning exercise that's been done anywhere in the country. And it's done in Utah, right in the far west, right? Individual rights and freedom, strongly Republican state. And yet, everyone started realizing in the technocratic community, looking at the numbers, that everyone in Utah essentially lives in this strip of towns between, Provo and Ogden, with Salt Lake City in between in this one valley. And there wasn't, if you looked at the projections of how fast the state was moving, there wouldn't be enough water, transportation, or anything for the valley. You could extrapolate what a mess this was going to become, and it was going to undermine everything that Utahns like about Utah, all the way down to the communitarian experiences and the values and stuff of the LDS community that helped found it. And so the realization was there, but the idea that state or anybody else would impose this, we need light rail, you need smaller incentives for smaller building sizes, you need to plan out these things so that there's enough water and stuff to go around, so that there's affordable housing, so your kids can live where 40 years from now, your kids and grandkids will be able to live in this valley near you. And so what they did was they intentionally organized it all. They created these big listening sessions through a private-public partnership nonprofit groups, invited everyone, kind of put the questions out there in the data and kind of let people sort of figure out the different scenarios themselves. Which Utah would you like to live in? Scenario A, B, C, or D? This is where we do nothing, this is where we do this and that. And those convening sessions, which were quietly backed by a lot of the powerful people in Utah, but not formally, allowed all of these people and constituencies and stakeholders to realize, oh my gosh, we don't want the standalone do nothing, we need C or B. And they ended up being able to create this broad-based support to go ahead and build an entire light rail system and set up all these long-term planning, which is now extended across the entire state of Utah. So some lessons like that about how to do things where initially the ideas you're putting forward are going to raise a hornet's nest and of opposition. Utah found a way around that. It's a different social and political context than ours, but the similarities between what you're trying to do of a bottom-up sourcing and how you encourage a bottom-up conversation to happen, I think there's some remarkable lessons there and probably in other places in the country that I think are fungible to the task ahead for us.
Great. Another question. Maine, like a lot of states, isn't really set up to review projects that have regional impacts, developments of regional impact. A community will approve a project within its boundaries, and other than a few state actions like a traffic movement permit, it's mostly a local decision. What are some examples of places that have been able to look at those regional impacts in a more holistic way, with some teeth, with some ability to actually affect projects?
I don't think I have a good
Well, I guess I'll jump in.
Okay.
The Metropolitan Area Planning Council in Boston, in the Boston area, I think it's 110 communities in greater Boston. That's our regional planning agency. And there are several others across the Commonwealth. In terms of teeth, that lies mostly with the MPO. It also serves as the MPO, and there is a great deal of structure there. Of course, that relates to transportation infrastructure. Otherwise, they have the bully pulpit, and they arguably need to get better and better at communicating about the value of looking at the impact of various choices in land use and development on that regional scale. When I say my first book was called This Land, The Battle Over Sprawl and the Future of America. And I was always fascinated about how, various towns in greater Boston and out towards 495, the second beltway, they put all their big box stores, and I mean, this is a tried and true method, right? You put all the big box stores and the traffic generating thing at the edge of town. So the neighboring town has to deal with it, and good luck with that. Not much communication going on there. So I feel that pain, but regional planning agencies have kind of struggled to confront that.
Great. Another question relates to post-COVID recovery and perhaps opportunities to take advantage of disruption in a positive way, and perhaps look at whether we might need some regional structures to help best recover from the pandemic, as opposed to relying on each community to sort of take care of its own permitting and development system as we move forward.
I think the answer is going to be yes. I mean, the pandemic, which is probably going to go on in effect for another year or so before life might return to something of normal, is going to have disrupted the whole way we live and function. We're not even moving around in the same sense. I mean, we're starting to become localized in our communities because we can't leave and can't go anywhere to convene. But that may leave a hangover effect, and people are reassessing. Do we need this office or as big a one? What meetings are required? Does it really make sense for me to spend the next hour and a half of my day in a car, rather than just starting meetings like I've been doing for the past year and a half? All of those questions will be answered all over the country, including Maine. So, we've been forced into reassessing our assumptions all of a sudden. So yeah, it's going to give us an opportunity to consider these kinds of questions, and probably coupled, I would imagine, with a considerable external stimulus money is probably going to have to be brought to bear by the federal government sometime in all of this process that could be capitalized on. Now, how is that going to look? in Maine, how are we going to do those regional things? I think that's a totally separate question, but I'm certain that it's on the agenda and it's an opportunity that we have and ought to seize as you're trying to deal with these issues.
Great. Anything to add to that, Anthony?
Yeah, so I again would refer to that City Lab piece in April, where as a practical matter, these different states, had begun to coordinate, not only on procurement for personal protective equipment, but on the recovery, as I suggested. Another interesting feature about this topsy-turvy situation that we're all in is that there's a little bit of a silver lining in that cities are making rather speedy progress in reshaping the public realm. It's remarkable if you think about it, the way that parking spaces have been turned over to streeteries, and that like as in the Slow Streets initiative in Oakland, of course, many other cities turning over more of the public realm to biking and walking, and of course, those modes of transport are very much de rigueur at this time, and of course, also greener. The construction in public works has actually had a chance to get sped up because of the lack of traffic, and the cities are ghost towns, and that is an opportunity to work hard at various elements, anticipating this post-COVID future.
Great. Another question related to home rule. One of the advantages and disadvantages of home rule, as you both mentioned, is the idea of the volunteer and the fact that you have local boards that have volunteers that live in the community. One of the challenges we're seeing, particularly in Maine, where there's a number of towns that are not very big, is getting people to fill these seats. It's harder and harder to get volunteers to participate in these boards and commissions, to the point where sometimes they can't even fill all the seats. What role might that play in pushing towards regional solutions? Or is there a way to sort of figure out how to get people to reinvigorate that volunteer base?
Right. Well, that's one of the big questions, right? Professionalism by default. I mean, you see it in all sorts of things. EMS services, for instance, that used to be all volunteer, and there aren't as many volunteers, and the demands on EMS services are larger, and the technical requirements and the training. You need people who are actually paid a salary to go out and do all this stuff. That's true in so many elements of 21st century life. And coupled with, despite that legacy and heritage we have of sort of communitarian civic involvement, obviously that's declined over time, as it has everywhere in the country, technology and everything else playing a role, and with that there's less volunteers and less people showing up. So yeah, it's going to push some communities to realize they have to do otherwise because the status quo doesn't work anymore. And in some communities there may be an effort to revitalize those things. How do you revitalize things? I mean, I think you have to have contexts where people can participate, where they feel like their participation is having a meaningful effect, right? If there are going to be new innovations that contribute towards the regionalization and economic development and social development and civic goals we have, finding ways in which the volunteer and the prospective elected office holder can meaningfully participate in those things is a way to jumpstart those functions. It also reduces costs if you have an effective volunteer basis who does that. But you're working against demographics. We live in an older and ever aging state, and fewer and fewer young people around to reinvigorate the population, and the frenetic pace of 21st century life, and people juggling jobs and kids, and sometimes having to have multiple jobs to make ends meet. It's harder to have time to volunteer and all that. So those are the things you're working against.
Yeah, I would just add, I think at the local level, there has in some places been almost a resurgence of interest and activity, particularly among young people. And I would point to, again, the Yes in My Backyard movement in the Bay Area, elsewhere in California, and again, even in Brookline. This group, which essentially just promotes more multifamily housing or addressing affordable housing, by adjusting these various zoning policies and other things. There's, one of their members is trying to get on a local board. They're running for the board of select board. They're serving on neighborhood associations, and using, and I think this is really important, using social media and a Facebook page and so forth to really organize pretty effectively. And before you know it, there could be a small majority of Yes in My Backyard housing advocates in a town meeting or on a particular town board. So in terms of volunteering, I think there is hope. Now, if you look at Brookline and San Francisco, these are particular kinds of communities, where there's almost like competition to get on the local board, that there might not be that luxury of having that civic interest and activity in other places. So I certainly understand that. But anyway, I would just point to Yes in My Backyard as an example of regular citizens getting involved in local democracy.
I mean, in terms of providing context, I mean, there's always, it's an important thing to identify because there's going to be a tension between maintaining or growing a volunteer base and the implications of regionalization, right? That's kind of the themes in the talk I was talking about how those things are often end up being zero-sum, and you want them not to be and figure out ways to minimize that. Like I was just thinking about EMS where we were sitting here, why is EMS professionalized? Well, we have a whole bunch of new techniques. People can save lives they couldn't have before, but in a way they have to and keep people alive because we regionalized our hospitals, right? The hospitals are all becoming hub and spoke. It's not your local hospital. In almost every instance you're going to be transferred somewhere else to do most procedures. The ambulances have to do those procedures. They have to people to keep you alive to do them. So the very fact of regionalizing and making the hospitals more efficient has forced outward implications for the volunteer sector where they have to professionalize because of the burdens being placed on them. And you can play that out in all sorts of contexts. So that's one of the things, that I don't have a solution, but that's one of the problems which if we could mitigate, it would be to our good of figuring out ways to minimize that transfer that happens where you lose the civic engagement and the volunteer engagement as the professional demands grow, which they usually do when you consolidate your fire department from volunteer fire departments to a consolidated county one or whatever you're doing.
Sure. I mean, I think clearly EMS is seen as one of those regional successes, the 911 call centers, some transportation efforts. One of the consolidation efforts in Maine that has been seen as less successful is school consolidation. That's been a real challenge and sort of stuck in a partial implementation phase to some extent. Any thoughts on that, on the idea of regionalizing schools?
I'll briefly jump in because I live in Freeport, which is RSU 5, which is one of those arranged marriages that haven't worked out all that well. The three towns, Freeport, Pownell, and Durham, don't quite see eye to eye. The cartoon sketches, many in Freeport want to be Yarmouth, and in Pownell and Durham, we're rural communities where we can't afford that, and so constant tension over everything about school investment and the like. The lesson in there is these things are most successful when there's been a way that the participants have voluntarily formed their alliances, or else you often get outcomes that aren't all that great. So that's just my remarks on consolidation in general. You got to be pretty clever, like that Utah example of figuring out ways to encourage those things to happen and still have the participants have decided, assessed it, and made it their own. but that therein lie the complexities of trying to regionalize in an environment of, strong, autonomous, communitarian assemblages.
Mm-hmm. Anthony, anything to add on that? You think Brookline and Boston are going to merge their school systems anytime soon?
Yeah, I should point out that as you well know, Jeff, Brookline famously resisted the effort to be annexed and be part of Boston. So no such consolidations, I think, are in the offing. And yeah, I think that school consolidation, and I mean, not to be negative, but it does sort of give a black eye to regionalism because of those instances where, for various reasons, it hasn't worked out. I mean, I think there is some trial and error here. I would also suggest, it may sound superficial, but it's almost a matter of branding. And Jeff, you mentioned the trying to sort of band together the regional transit authorities. If there was some way to communicate to riders, how terrific this is, but with a lot of, not so many acronyms and, the RTPA, and it's so hard to keep track of. As a matter of branding, I think it might be possible to develop ridership for something like that, and really make different communities, sort of feel more part of a regional system like that. So that's the challenge, or one of the many challenges.
Great, and we're running short on time. We have so many good questions. I want to apologize to the ones I don't get to, but we have time for one or two more. In terms of housing affordability, especially for low-income and workforce housing, what about the role of providing housing so that people can work where they live or live where they work, or have some sort of regional approach to housing? Is there an opportunity for success there? People are so protective of housing in their communities.
Well, I'll jump in and then turn it over to Colin. After the George Floyd murder, a lot of people in Brookline and other places, asked, what can they do? One of the first responses was stop opposing multifamily housing projects in your community. It's a matter of connecting the dots and learning how Black and brown people have really been prevented from growing wealth in terms of home ownership, sort of deflected at every turn, the awful legacy of redlining and so forth, really starting out deep in the hole. So that's how you get from stopping being a NIMBY to racial justice. And it's really simple. Brookings came out with a report showing how more multifamily dense housing and a little bit more density at transit stations, this incredible system of the T that we have in Greater Boston. Again, a regional framework. There are parking lots at most of the stations, or vacant lots, the urgent need for more housing and increasing the housing supply and different kinds of housing options, not just a single family house with all of the legacy there in terms of discrimination and zoning, but multifamily accessory dwelling units, shared equity housing, community land trusts, even manufactured homes. They should all be in the mix as a range of housing options that are appropriate to the different demographics. I think linking all of that to current events might help get people to rethink the sort of, at the ramparts and pulling up the drawbridge reaction that we so often see in our communities.
Great. And I think with that, we're out of time. I want to thank Colin and Anthony for offering their thoughts here. It's been really an interesting morning. Logistically, the next step, we're going to be taking a break for 15 minutes. For those of you who are in Biddeford, there's coffee on the sideboard, there's boxed breakfasts in the kitchen, bottled water in the fridge for us, bathrooms out the main door and to the right. We're going to reconvene at 11:30 with a combination of in-person and online groups for discussion, and then Smart Growth Awards over lunch. So thanks very much to our keynotes. So I think our next item is to propose to have our general election to see if there's a slate to nominate for board members for GrowSmart Maine, for officers. Do we have a nomination? All right, Carl's going to move. What are you moving? The slate as shown. So that would be Kirsten Brewer, Philip Hussey, Ethan Boxer-McComber, and Sally Stockwell. Are you moving that? That is the slate I'm moving. All right, do we have a second? We have a second. Are we ready? Any conversation before we vote? Nancy, give me a thumbs down if I'm missing anything here.
With the remote locations, we're asking our board members to gather the votes at the remote locations.
Okay.
Virtual people can vote by sending a message to the same place for the questions.
Okay.
GSM asks questions, so we'll have a few minutes to gather up the votes.
Okay, so we're going to slow this a little bit. If you're in a remote location and you're a board member, we're going to ask each remote location to gather those votes up. And then if you're voting remotely, just send a chat to GSM questions. Private chat saying whether you support the slate or not. So we're going to wait a little bit just so that people can gather that up. And then we're going to reconvene in maybe a minute just to have the actual vote. So.
And then we anticipate 30 minutes of lunch with some videos and then the Smart Growth.
Yep, so then we'll have lunch with videos and then the Smart Growth Awards. So I'll cue the waiting music from game shows for 30 seconds here. All right, do you guys think that's enough time? Have you been getting chats, votes? Okay, so let's gather up the board members who are voting here. First, the folks voting in support of the slate. So we have 4 in support, 5 in support. And 4, so 9 total, and then are there any from the other remote groups?
Bangor, it's all members vote, it's just the board members collecting it, so Bangor is all affirmative.
Okay. And anyone opposed in Biddeford? Any other opposition? Okay, the slate is confirmed, and I think with that, the meeting is concluded. Oh, okay, sorry, next slide. Yes, of course. So there's also a slate of officers. We need a nomination for this proposed slate of officers. Oh, Carl? Okay, Carl is and a second on that? Okay, we also have a second on that. Any discussion on this before we vote? Okay, so we will do the same vote. We'll give the 30 seconds for everyone to gather their votes. And is this all members, or is this just the board that votes? All members. So don't be shy. Feel free to vote. I'll call for a vote in here in a little bit. In the meantime, the remote groups will gather, and if you're online, feel free to send a chat, a yes or a no. Okay, in this room, all those in favor? Opposed? Okay, this room votes in favor. Machias has voted in favor. Favor, Bangor's voted in favor. Hollowell is in favor. All right, are we all set? All right, we're all set. We have a majority vote. The slate is elected. Congratulations. And with that, I conclude the meeting. Have lunch. Yes, not the summit, just the meeting.
Hi, I'm Tom Rump. I'm a member of the board of GrowSmart, and I hope that you all are enjoying your lunches here in the satellite locations. I have the pleasure of introducing our video that's going to talk about our Smart Growth Award winners today. And for those of you who may not know, we've been doing the Smart Growth Awards for 3 years now. And it's a way for us to sort of highlight some of the good things that are happening around the state of Maine involving smart growth principles. And I think you'll find our award winners this year to be a very diverse group geographically and otherwise. And Ethan Boxer Macumber put together a video to share with us. It's, I think, about a 10, 15-minute video. So we're going to run that now. And let's see what it looks like.
Hello, and welcome to the 3rd Annual Maine Smart Growth Awards, a program of GrowSmart Maine.
In 2020, GrowSmart Maine is proud to recognize 6 outstanding projects or persons that exemplify the principles and promise of smart growth in Maine. These 6 2020 award recipients were chosen by a distinguished 4-member judging panel comprised of
Maine Conservation Voters Director Maureen Druin, Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission Director Paul Schumacher, Maine Land Use Planning Commissioner Gwen Hilton, and retired economist Chuck Lawton.
Our judges evaluated nominations submitted from across the state using criteria that included mixed use, compact design, and placemaking,
Housing Opportunity and Choice,
transportation choice and walkable communities,
Preservation of Open Space,
community transformation,
Climate Change Resilience,
and public engagement.
and so now, without further ado, we are pleased to present to you the 6 recipients of the 2020 Maine Smart Growth Awards.
CWS Architects and Bangor Savings Bank. Outstanding project. Bangor Savings Bank's new waterfront campus includes a state-of-the-art operations center, a fully remodeled corporate headquarters, and a parking facility, all designed by CWS Architects. The vision for Bangor Savings' new campus was to invest in the local community, integrate environmental responsibility, and serve as a catalyst for restoring Bangor's prosperity. The facility's extensive renewable energy systems include 80 geothermal wells and 1,400 photovoltaic solar panels, one of the state's largest solar arrays. These technologies, together with efficient building materials and components, have reduced heating and cooling needs for the entire facility by approximately 80%. The campus landscape was designed without physical barriers or fences to promote public access to green space. The campus encourages wellness at work with a gym, expansive rooftop patios, and daylight views visible from all workspaces, resulting in an employee-centric workplace that redefines the company's culture. The project demonstrates the smart growth that is possible when strong Maine-based companies, with a commitment to employees, community, and the environment, make strategic investments in Maine communities. It is therefore GrowSmart Maine's honor to award this 2020 Maine Smart Growth Award to CWS Architects and Bangor Savings Bank.
Planner Mark Eierman, demonstrable commitment to smart growth. For 35 years, Mark Eierman has been a practicing planner in Maine, working with over 30 Maine municipalities, coastal and inland, urban and rural. Mark has brought smart growth principles not only to these communities, but to the many others that have followed his examples. Throughout his illustrious planning career, Mark has been an effective change agent, applying innovative strategies such as transfer of development rights, proportional density, form-based codes, transit-oriented development, and sustainable stormwater standards. Strategies now in place in so many Maine communities. Mark meets communities where they are, with exceptional communication skills and unwavering dedication to public participation. This mastery of the public process has empowered him to effectively promote mixed use and walkable design across Maine. Excellent town and city planning takes shape slowly and incrementally and often escapes public awareness. But Mark Eierman's impact is felt across Maine through smart growth principles put into tangible action. Ask his peers and they will tell you, Mark's legacy as a progressive planner in Maine is second to none and will never be forgotten. It is therefore GrowSmart Maine's honor to award this 2020 Maine Smart Growth Award to Mark Eierman.
Port Property Management and Consulting Partners, outstanding project. Port Property Management has a long, successful history of quality urban redevelopment projects, and in recent years has made significant investments in Portland's Bayside neighborhood. In 2017, the City of Portland released an RFP for the redevelopment of a former Public Works maintenance building at 82 Hanover Street, which was a brownfield site and stood in a state of blight and disrepair. Port Property Management devised a plan to convert the site into a vibrant, pedestrian-oriented, mixed-use commercial center and was awarded the project. Today, the project is fully occupied with a lively variety of local food, beverage, fitness, and service businesses whose social and economic activity at 82 Hanover have attracted other investments to the neighborhood. Multiple new market rate and affordable housing units for rent and for sale have recently been developed in the nearby vicinity, with 200 additional units in the planning phases for other adjacent lots. 82 Hanover is exemplary of how strong city leadership partnered with a visionary smart growth-oriented developer can provide the catalyst to transform an abandoned industrial block of town into a vibrant new neighborhood. It is therefore GrowSmart Maine's honor to award this 2020 Maine Smart Growth Award to Port Property Management and Consulting Partners.
Raise Up Housing Cooperative, demonstrable commitment to smart growth. Founded in 2008 in response to housing challenges facing downtown Lewiston, the Raise Up Housing Cooperative's mission is to operate safe and affordable housing that's democratically controlled by its members on a nonprofit basis and according to the principles of respect, accountability, integration, solidarity, and equity. Raise Up currently owns and operates 3 apartment buildings housing 50 resident members and 15 households. In the coming years, Raise Up is on track to double this resident population by expanding its portfolio through rehabilitation as well as new construction projects. As a cooperative, Raise Up resident members meet regularly to make budgetary and maintenance decisions. Members not only control the operation of their buildings, but also advocate for housing justice and a cooperative economy. Raise Up has participated in neighborhood improvements such as developing a center for the Somali Bantu Community Association, a community vegetable garden, and a neighborhood pocket park. And Raise Up has also partnered with the City of Lewiston in pursuit of a Choice Neighborhood Implementation Grant from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The Raise Up Housing Cooperative provides a model for Maine communities, not just in terms of a model for housing, but also by demonstrating how cooperative members can leverage the power of their housing community to effect meaningful community change. It is therefore GrowSmart Maine's honor to award this 2020 Maine Smart Growth Award to Lewiston's Raise Up Housing Cooperative.
Great Falls Construction, outstanding project. Since 1988, Great Falls Construction has been committed to constructing with a purpose and providing quality construction to enhance Maine's economic growth and prosperity. Station Square is a great representation of Great Falls' commitment to excellence and meeting diverse community needs in construction. It stands as a 5-story mixed-use building that provides 33 residential and 6 commercial units located in the heart of Gorham's thriving village. With its Grand Clock Tower, Station Square welcomes residents and visitors of Gorham into the village. Station Square is currently home to nearly 50 residents and serves as a hub for village entertainment, dining, commerce, and more. The Station Square project by Great Falls Construction transforms Gorham's village into a more walkable center while also enhancing and drawing upon the historical identity of Gorham as a train-traveled community. Station Square signals a reverse to the decades-long trend of leapfrog development and sprawl that has impacted so many of our communities and provides hope for the rebirth of Maine's traditional walkable village center. It is therefore GrowSmart Maine's honor to award this 2020 Maine Smart Growth Award to Great Falls Construction.
The Moosehead Lake Region Economic Development Corporation. Demonstrable commitment to smart growth. The Moosehead Lake Region Economic Development Corporation's mission is to help grow and sustain local businesses, attract and create new jobs, and enhance the economy of the Moosehead Lake region by leveraging the region's rich natural assets and plentiful year-round recreational opportunities. In recent years, MLR EDC, in partnership with a broad and inclusive range of public and private community stakeholders, has designed and implemented a regional master plan, strategic regional action plans, as well as branding initiatives. These efforts embody the principles of smart growth and have already led to many tangible accomplishments, such as wayfinding infrastructure, free downtown Wi-Fi hotspots, a visiting artist colony, a summer music series, and broad-scale village beautification projects. In the region's village centers, efforts have already begun to catalyze increases in the number and variety of unique shops, restaurants, and businesses operating on ground floors and residents living on upper floors. Most recently, the organization acquired a major in-town waterfront property with a vision to form strategic partnerships and develop this property consistent with the Greenville Downtown Plan. Moosehead Lake Region's EDC's many accomplishments serve as a model of how smart growth and community vitality can be achieved in rural Maine communities. It is therefore GrowSmart Maine's honor to award this 2020 Maine Smart Growth Award to the Moosehead Lake Region Economic Development Corporation. This concludes the presentation of the 2020 Maine Smart Growth Awards. Thank you for watching. We'll look forward to seeing you again here next year.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to recognize that we did have a couple of representatives of our award winners on the remote link-ups, and Tom Watson is here from Port Property Management also, so if you want to talk to any award winner, you can all focus on Tom. Thank you very much, and now I think Ben is going to wrap things up here.
Great, thank you very much. This has been a great program, and it was really cool to see the way those awards came together. I think that it's more important than ever to take time to recognize the great things that people are doing across the state in a wide variety of settings. I would also like at this point to once again thank our sponsors for their support today and partner locations. We're at the end of the program, so a lot of the folks who are joining us virtually from wherever you are, thank you very much for attending. Appreciate your contributions to today's event. And for those of you who are at physical locations, wherever you are, you may be entitled to attend some bonus activities. I know that here in Biddeford, there's going to be a walking tour, taking a look at the local food scene, so that will certainly be appreciated. But once again, thank you very much to our sponsors and partners. Congratulations to all the award winners, and we look forward to engaging with you over the course of the coming year. Great, thank you.